Welcome back. My name's Sawyer and this is my personal project for fall 2022-2023, the science behind knife making. So I've made a couple knives in the past and I'd just like to document the process in this personal project because it's super interesting and there's a lot behind the subject. So I have this piece of high carbon steel. This is a truck leaf spring and I'm going to go over why I use this later on in the video and all steel properties and everything. So we're going to be making a small kind of camp bushcraft hiking knife, all-purpose fixed blade. In this video, so we're going to go over the whole process from shaping the knife, grinding in the bevels, heat treating, which is kind of the main focus of this video, and shaping the handle, and then at the end we're going to test and see what the results will be. So I want to follow the scientific method in this video, which is observe, ask questions, form a hypothesis, experiment, analyze, and draw conclusions. So the first step in this is going to be cutting out the general profile of the knife, and we're kind of going to move quickly through the process of the beginning stages so that we can primarily focus on heat treating, which is the main topic of the video. It's the science behind knife making. Heat treating, brief explanation, is taking a piece of steel that is mild, it's been annealed, it's all soft, it's basically what a butter knife is, and heat treating it through the process of heating and cooling the steel very quickly to form a hard, nice, usable tool. So that's going to be the main focus of this video, but for now we're going to cut the knife out of this piece of steel here. This is a leaf spring that I have thinned out and flattened on the milling machine at Metalwork. I'm taking Metalwork at school right now, so I flattened it out and it's all prepped to start making. So without further ado, let's get going. Okay, before we get going, I want to briefly talk about the steel that I'm using and the steel that you would have to use to make a functional knife. So obviously I'm using steel. It is an alloy between two elements, iron and carbon, to form a superior metal. So this is a truck leaf spring, and the reason why I'm using a truck leaf spring, this random thing, is because it has a very high carbon content. So there is different types of steel. You have mild steel, you have high carbon steel, you have stainless steel. There's lots of different types of steels. This is high carbon steel, which means the carbon content mixed with the iron is very high. So this has a very high carbon content because it is going through a lot of stress in the vehicle as a spring. So you need to use a carbon steel to perform an optimal heat treat on the knife, which is, again, making it hard into a usable tool. So that's the reason why I'm using a truck leaf spring. Other materials that you could use would be saw blades, files, things of that nature that are going through a lot of stress. You can obviously purchase metal online too. This leaf spring has a similar composition to 1084 high carbon steel. So that's how we're going to be kind of following the directions to heat treat this. I'm going to be basing it off of 1084. Now there's also stainless steels. Now stainless steels still have a very high carbon content, just like carbon steel, but it has an extra element called coronium, which makes it stainless. So the three kind of areas of steel is toughness, which means how well it can hold up to abuse, edge retention, which is how long it can stay sharp, and corrosion resistance, which is how stainless it is. Now generally, you can pick two of those three elements to be really good, and the third one will be just like not so good. Or you can have all three, but they will all be just mediocre. So not great and not bad, they're just all good, which is like just okay. So it's a very well-rounded steel. Now, example of this would be CPM S110V. This is a powdered steel made by Crucible in the United States, and it prioritizes edge retention over everything else. So it also has very good corrosion resistance, but edge retention is the main thing. So if you're cutting things like cardboard, soft materials over and over all day long, something that would easily dull the knife, CPM S110V would be a great option because it'll stay sharp for a very long time. But this means that the toughness is also not going to be very good. So the toughness on CPM S110V is terrible. It is super brittle. The edge is very chippy. So if you were going to use this on, like, let's say an axe or a really big, like, machete style that you're going to be cutting hard materials like wood with big impacts, it's going to be terrible because the edge is going to roll, it's going to chip, it's going to dull, and it's going to be horrible to sharpen. And you're not going to be able to use those edge retention abilities. So different steels can help you in certain scenarios, but there is also other factors such as edge geometry, which is how thin or thick the final cutting edge will be. So if you were, for example, making an axe, you're not going to want the axe blade to be super thin steel with a very thin bevel and cutting edge because it's not going to be very strong. You're going to want a nice thick material with what generally is used on axes is a convex grind, which means the grind is kind of curved towards the edge. So it's not like flat and it's not hollow. It's curved, and this makes it very good at splitting things and being very strong because it's got more material near the edge. Now, if you were cutting things like cardboard, this isn't going to work very well for you because it's a lot of material to pass through the cardboard. So if you're cutting lots of cardboard, you're going to want a very thin blade stock with a very thin final cutting edge, such as a full flat grind or a hollow grind, which are going to make the final cutting edge very, very sharp and very thin so that it can pass through the material very easily with very little struggle. So you can see how all these different elements play a part in an optimal knife blade. Now, if we take all of these elements and pick and choose which ones we want in the knife that I'm going to be making, which is a small camp all-purpose hiking knife. So I'm thinking it's going to be primarily used for cutting rope, maybe some light wood carving for carving tents. We're not going to be doing anything crazy with it, like cutting down trees and clearing brush or anything. It might be used for some light food prep. So I'm thinking I want a fairly thin blade stock, not super thin, not pocket knife thin, but thin enough that it can still pass through everyday materials like cardboard. So it's still usable. And I think I'm going to have a flat grind, because that's kind of in between a convex grind and a hollow grind. Hollow grind is used on like very thin, like a scalpel would be a hollow grind. A convex grind is used on axes, so flat grind is right in the middle. So I'm probably going to use that. And then the steel that I'm going to be using is high carbon steel. Now this means that it will rust, but as long as I take care of it, it will be fine. And this is going to prioritize toughness over everything, and it's going to prioritize edge retention. So toughness will be the best, edge retention will be pretty good, corrosion resistance not so great. Now, the first step in the scientific method or process is observation. Now, there are lots of things that we can observe throughout the knife making process. Some examples being the difference between annealed or soft and hardened / heat treated steel. Now, annealed steel is just very mild, soft. It's the state that it's in when you're working on the knife before you perform the heat treating step to make it a usable tool. So, annealed steel is how you work on the knife. So you can cut into the steel with your tools. So if you use a hand file to glide along the steel, like trying to remove material, if it bites in and if it's removing material, then that tells you that the steel is not heat treated. This is a very DIY way to do this. There are machines that will tell you exactly what the hardness is of the steel, but if you're doing this at home, this is the way that I'm going to be doing it. So if you take a file, if it bites into it, then it's annealed steel. Now if it's hardened, if heat treat was achieved and you have a hardened tool, then if you glide a file along the hardened edge, if it skates the file, it's called skating a file. If the file doesn't bite into it, if it's not removing material, if it feels like it's just gliding across glass, you can also hear it, it sounds different, then the steel is hardened, it's heat treated. Another thing that we could observe is how to tell if steel has a high enough carbon content to make a knife out of it. Now again, you can buy steels online that have the exact composition listed, but if you're doing it how I'm doing it, with scrap steels that you don't really know what is making up the steel, then you can tell if it's high carbon steel or mild steel by the sparks that come off of it. If the sparks are very long, like they shoot long trails and they're very straight, then that is telling you that it is mild steel. It does not have a very high carbon content. If the steel is shooting big, bushy, almost like fireworks, if it's really bushy sparks, then that tells you that it does have carbon. Now again, this is a very DIY way to do this, but if you're in a situation like me where you don't have all the proper tools, then this is a very valid method of determining whether the steel is usable or not. Another observation that we can make is how heat treating has been done at home DIY by other people in the past. Now there are lots of videos on YouTube about this being done, this exact thing that I'm going to be attempting. Now obviously there are very professional ways that people should go about doing this if you're selling or producing knives with special kilns that have the perfect temperature, quenching it exactly right, having the temperature of the temper to the perfect degree. But we're going to be attempting this completely DIY at home, which is a whole different topic, but it has been done before. Like I said, I have also attempted on making a few knives in the past. A couple years ago, I made a fixed blade fairly similar to the one I'm doing now, and I didn't know quite as much back then, and I definitely didn't perform the heat treat in the most optimal way that I could have. The heat treat was alright from the basic ways of telling. If you achieved the right heat treat, it did skate a file, maybe not the best that it could have, but it did, and when I went out and used it, it performed fairly well. It did work as a tool, it did function as a knife, but not for very long. It did roll the edge the more I used it, and obviously you can sharpen it back, but the edge would roll only in a certain section, so you can kind of like see where the quench wasn't achieved. Now all of these terms that I'm talking about, quenching, tempering, I'm going to go over this later on in the video, so you don't have to worry about any of that. We're just on the observation stage right now. So I didn't achieve the most optimal heat treat that I could have. I'm going to be performing it differently though, this way around, so we'll see what happens. But it has been achieved by others at home doing very similar methods the way I'm going to be doing it. They have achieved very optimal heat treats with fantastic tolerances. Now that brings us to the second stage in the scientific method, which is asking questions. Now I'm going to be asking my leading question now, and at the end of the video At the analyzing and testing stage, I'm going to be answering yes or no. So the question is, can I perform an optimal or near optimal heat treat at home using very simple tools and methods?
Time to drill some holes.
Okay, so I've got all my holes drilled into the handle of the knife here, as you can see. Looks really good. The reason why I did so many here is obviously I've got the 2 holes where I'm going to put 2 pins in the handle to hold the handle on. I've also got this one here in the bottom corner as a lanyard hole. All the rest of them are for weight reduction, just removing excess material that's not needed. And it's also to let the epoxy pass through both sides when I glue the handles on, and it just creates more strength and bind when it can connect to each other. Each side can connect. So it's for strength, it's for weight reduction, just helps all in all. So my next step is to flatten out all of this. I did mill this down with the milling machine, so it is true on both sides, but I want to get all this nasty stuff that's on the edges off, and I need to get all the lines, all the sanding lines going along the knife. So I'm going to take this to school today, to metal shop, and I'm going to pop it on the belt grinder because they have a big belt grinder. I only have a little 1x30. So I'm going to get that done, which is right now. Okay.
Time for a brief explanation on the Rockwell scale. So the Rockwell scale is a scale that we use to determine the HRC, or hardness levels, of different types of steels. So I'm using leaf spring steel, which has a very similar composition to 1084 high carbon steel, which is what we're basing the heat treating recipe off of. So for 1084 steel, the ideal HRC, or hardness level, of the steel after quenching, which is the second step in the heat treating process, which is the process of making the blade hard, it should be ideally 63 to 64 HRC. Now after tempering, which is the third step in the heat treating process, which is taking the very hard but now brittle blade and tempering it to make it tougher, the ideal HRC then, after the whole heat treating process is complete, should be ideally 60 to 61 HRC. So there is a large piece of machinery called a Rockwell gauge, which gives you the exact measurement of the HRC of the steel. So it's essentially this big machine with a hardened tip that releases into your piece of steel, and it measures the pressure that it takes to put a small dent in the steel, giving you the exact HRC, or hardness level. Now, I do not have access to one of these machines personally, so none of my testing is going to be very accurate, But as we discussed in the observation section of the scientific method, there is a way to test if your blade is hardened or not by seeing if it skates a file after the quench process in heat treating. So I'm going to be taking a file and scraping it along the edge of the blade after quenching in the heat treating process. And if it skates it, if it doesn't bite into the knife, then we know that we have a very hard piece of steel, which is exactly what we want. Time for my hypothesis. So the next step in the scientific method is the hypothesis, and to make my hypothesis, I need to go back to the leading question, which is,
can I perform an optimal or near optimal heat treat at home using very simple tools and methods?
So I think I will be able to, but not to the highest degree seen on production knives. During heat treat, I will be able to normalize it well, get an adequate quench, and temper it accordingly. I have no Rockwell gauge, but I would estimate the HRC, or hardness level, of the steel after quench to be 63 to 64, the ideal HRC being 64 to 65. And after tempering, I would estimate the final hardness to be 58 to 59 HRC, ideally being 60 to 61.
Alright, it's the next day. Yesterday in metal shop, I used the belt grinder to flatten out the knife a little bit more. I also made a bevel grinding jig. So that's our next step, is to grind the bevels. The bevels is just taking it from a flat brick of steel and carving in the edge to make it sharp. It's called the bevels. So I'm going to be using a 1x30 inch belt grinder to do this, and I'm not very good at this. I've never done it before on a 1x30, so I made a jig. So this jig is super simple. It's just a piece of angle iron with a nut welded to it, and I could put the bolt in and out to adjust the angle like a set screw. So I'm going to clamp the knife to the piece of angle iron here, to the jig, and I'm going to use this can't twist clamp that I made in metal shop earlier in the semester just to hold this on, and then we're going to grind the bevels. So I'm doing all of this, as you can see, grinding the bevels, drilling the holes, all of the stuff that requires cutting into the metal before heat treat, because after heat treat it's going to be near impossible to do that, so we've got to get all of this done first. So we shall see how this goes. Let's go. Alright, it's December 23rd. It's been -20 and below for the past few days, so I haven't been able to work on the knife. But it's only -13 today. It's basically summer. So, time to grind the bevels. Alright, I'd say that's pretty good for the first side. Did a little messy up in the corner there, but yeah, pretty happy with that. Alright, we got it switched around. Time to do the next side.
Alright, I finished grinding in the bevels on the knife. It looks pretty good, went pretty well as I expected it to go. The left side got a little bit wonky because I'm right-handed, so grinding with the left hand is a little bit tricky, so you can see at the top there it's a little bit wonky. The plunge grinds, which is where the grind actually starts, are a little bit not super clean, but for my first time grinding bevels on a belt sander, I think it went pretty good. My next steps are to heat treat this bad boy, which is going to be quite the process, but it is the 23rd of December and Christmas is right around the corner, so I'm going to take a little break for that.
Alright, Christmas was great and I'm jumping right back into the project. So my next step is to heat treat the blade. So I am prepping it here by getting all my coarse grit hand sanding done beforehand, because if I were to do that afterwards, it would be a real pain to get all the deep scratch marks out once the blade is hardened.
So I'm here at Isaac and Caleb's house where we have a forge and we're going to heat treat the knife.
Okay, now time to guy on the dime.
What?
Alright, so the first step in the heat treating process is called normalizing. Normalizing is the act of evening out the grain structure of the knife using heat. So while we are grinding the knife, when we were cutting it out, drilling the holes, grinding in the bevels, we are heating up the knife and cooling it down in a very irregular, uneven way all the time. Now this is messing up the grain structure of the knife. So when steel gets really hot, the atoms inside of the steel are able to move around and jiggle around. And when we cool it, depending on how fast we cool it and to what temperature it was at beforehand, the atoms will start to cool and they will stay in place in whatever position they were in when it was hot. So if you can imagine, when we're grinding it and the friction is causing the blade to get hot, and then we're cooling it down with water so I'm still able to hold the knife while I'm grinding. And this is basically just making the grain structure of the knife very uneven. So when we harden the knife, the grain structure is going to be all wonky. There might be clumps of different stuff in different areas. And so the final edge is going to perform differently depending on where you're cutting along the edge of the knife. So when we normalize the blade, we are putting the knife in the forge and we are heating it up to critical temperature, which is around 1500 degrees Fahrenheit. And then we are doing that as evenly as we can inside the forge. We're going to take it out and we're going to let it sit and air cool for as long as we can. We want it to cool very slowly until we're able to pick it up. And that's just going to heat up the atoms so they're all jiggling and moving around. They're going to space out evenly while it's at critical temperature. And then we are taking it out, and when we let it cool very slowly, we're not disrupting the grain structure at all. And it's just going to cool in that even place that it was when it was hot. So to normalize it, we are going to do 3 normalizing cycles. We're going to put it in, bring it to critical temperature, take it out, let it cool. Do that 3 times, and then the grain structure will be very nice and even, and we will get a very good result when it comes to the next step in the heat treating process, which is hardening it. So the second step is called quenching, and it is the act of bringing the steel to critical temperature, just like a normalizing cycle, putting it in the forge, bringing it really hot, and then I am immediately going to dunk it into some canola oil to harden the blade. So what this is doing is when I put it in the forge and bring it to critical temperature, all the atoms are nice and even now due to the normalizing. They're jiggling around all spaced apart. And when I quench it super fast in the oil, it is cooling it down extremely rapidly. and all the atoms are forced to lock together really tightly, and that is creating the dense, hard blade. So before I quench the blade, I am going to quench this scrap piece of steel. As you can see here, I'm just heating it up really hot and dunking it in the oil, and that is to preheat the oil. So when the oil is preheated, it actually cools the blade faster, which seems counterintuitive, but when you heat up the oil, it is making the oil thinner, and when the oil is thin, it is able to cool down the steel quicker. Alright, so I'm just about ready to quench the blade now, but you may be wondering how I can tell when it's reached critical temperature. So there's a very simple way to do this. When steel reaches critical temperature, it becomes non-magnetic. This is because, like I said, the thermal energy makes the steel atoms jiggle, and that disturbs their magnetic alignment. And when the vibrations of the atoms becomes too great, the atomic magnets don't line up and the steel loses its magnetism. So this is a very easy way to tell. You can see here Caleb is just holding up a magnet for me, and I'm tapping the knife edge along the magnet to see if it sticks. If it doesn't, I'm going to put it back in the forge for a little bit longer, heating it up a couple of shades brighter, and then I'm going to dunk it in the oil.
Oh, you just gonna do it?
So right here you can see I am moving it around in the oil, trying to get it cooled as quickly as possible. And right after the initial quench, I have a little bit of time to check for warps, see if the blade is straight. It was still straight, so I put it back in and cooled it the rest of the way. Alright, that concludes step 2, which is hardening the blade. Thanks so much to Caleb and Isaac for letting me use their forge. Okay, I'm now going to test the hardness of the knife after quench before we temper it with a file to see if it skates a file. If the file doesn't dig into the blade, then we're good. Alright, that seems good. So you can even hear it. It's not digging in. It sounds like it's just skating across glass. You can see that it is removing the heat treating scale, but that's just the black stuff that's on top after heat treating. That's not the actual steel. So yeah, it's not digging in at all, which is perfect. Alright, so I'm pretty happy with that. This means that we got a successful quench and our blade is now hard. Alright, so now that we know the blade is for sure hardened, we can continue with the third step in heat treating, which is tempering. Now, tempering is essentially taking the hardened blade, which is very hard, but it is almost too hard, and it's making it brittle. So if you were to take the hardened blade and just drop it on a cement floor, it could actually shatter into a bunch of pieces, which is not something that you want in your knife. So you're going to take the hardened blade now that is very, very hard, and I'm going to essentially cook it, and I'm bringing that hardness level down, or the HRC level down, just a little bit so that the knife is tough and it can withstand impacts and hard use. So to temper the blade, I'm just going to cook it in a toaster oven for 2 2-hour cycles at 400 degrees Fahrenheit. So I'm going to put it in the toaster oven, cook it at 400 for 2 hours, then I'm going to take it out and let it air cool very slowly as to not disrupt the grain structure. And then I'm going to put it back in, cook it for another 2 hours at 400, take it out, and again let it cool very slowly, and then we will have successfully completed the heat treating process. So you can usually find a heat treating recipe for most steels. I'm basing this recipe off of 1084 steel, if you can remember. So there is a little bit of guidelines on tempering, and this is when you can really refine what HRC or hardness level you want your knife to be. So I was aiming for 60 to 61 HRC, which is giving me the recipe for 400 degrees. Now at the end of the last cycle, you can tell if your blade is tempered or not by what color it is. So when I tried to file the blade there to see if it was hard, I removed some of the black coating on it, revealing the silver. So if the silver part is a kind of light gold straw color, then you have successfully tempered your knife. And that's pretty much it. If you did it all correctly, you should now have a good, usable knife. All right, I finished heat treating the knife. Now it's time to hand sand it and get it looking nice and shiny. All right, the blade is all finished up, looks really good. I'm now going to drill the holes in my scales for the pins. So I did this massacre job and taped the blade to the handles in the orientation that they would be in on the actual knife. And I'm just going to drill through one, put a pin in, drill through the other, put a pin in, drill, and that will just make sure that the blade doesn't shift and that the holes are in the right spot. Alright, I've got the front portion of the scales all finished up down to 600 grit, and I'm finishing these before I glue them on because once they're on the blade I'm not going to be able to get in there with the sandpaper. So now that that is done, it is time to epoxy these onto the knife. Okay, so I've got some 2-part epoxy here. I'm going to get this mixed up and we're going to apply it to each of the scales and both sides of the knife handle and both of the pins, and I'm going to clamp it all together. This is 5-minute epoxy, so it sets in 5 minutes, and then I'm going to leave it overnight to cure completely. Alright, it's the next day. I just unclamped the knife here. It looks really good. There is epoxy squeeze out all the way around.
So that means there was epoxy covering all the surfaces, so there's not going to be any gaps. So now I just have to cut off the pins shorter, rough out the shape, and then sand it all nice and flat. Alright, there you have it. I'm officially done the knife build. It came out really good. I'm really happy with it. The handles are very smooth and ergonomic, and I got a razor sharp edge on there. So now we are moving into the next step in the scientific method, which is experimenting and testing. So if you can remember, after heat treat, after the quench, I tested the edge with a file to see if it skated a file. And that was also part of the experimenting process. So we're going to draw conclusions about that later in the next step, which is analyzing. So now we're going to move into the next half of the experimenting process, and I'm going to put this through some basic use. I'm going to test the edge retention by cutting a bunch of cardboard, and we're going to be comparing it to a production knife with good heat treat, and we're going to see how the two compare, how it performs, how well it holds the edge. After that, I'm going to resharpen it, and I'm going to cut some harder materials like wood and see if the edge rolls or chips at all, and then we'll analyze it afterwards and draw conclusions. Alright, here is my knife. It is razor sharp. We're going to cut some cardboard. Alright, there's 30 cuts. Okay, not too bad. Okay, now we're going to try this production Ontario Rat Model 2 in D2 high carbon steel. This steel primarily focuses on edge retention. It is a carbon steel, so it is not stainless, and it is fairly tough. This is what I'm going to be comparing it to. Now keep in mind that the Ontario Rat here has a much thinner blade stock than the fixed blade that I made. So this is going to be, it's going to be pushing through the cardboard easier, but the edge damage is going to be the same. So it is equally as sharp as the other one was in the beginning. we're going to cut some cardboard with this guy. Alright, there's 30 cuts with the rat. Okay. So it still cuts. Definitely duller than before. Alright, we're going to do a couple more cuts with the fixed blade. Oh, this cardboard is wet. Okay, now we're going to do the rest of the cuts, again with the folder, and these ones, because they are so short and I'm running out of cardboard, one cut through this counts as half a cut. So 2 cuts in this would be 1 full cut for all you people counting. Alright, the moment of truth. Here is 50 total cuts with the folding knife. Okay. And here is 50 total cuts with the homemade fixed blade. Alright, that concludes edge retention testing. Alright, now that we've tested edge retention, we're now going to test edge strength or toughness. So to test the toughness of the blade, this is testing the tempering cycle in the heat treatment, which was the last one when I essentially cooked it in the toaster oven to make the knife less brittle, so that the edge is more tough. So I'm just going to hack into this piece of wood here, and we're just going to see what happens to the final apex of the edge. Right now, if I run my nail across, it is glassy smooth. There are no rolls or chips in the edge. So after cutting a little bit more harder material, we'll see if it rolls or chips. And if it doesn't, that means our temper was successful. And if it does, then it was probably not so great. So we're going to see what happens. Alright, so I'm done with testing the toughness on the knife. I gave it some basic use, cutting some wood. Let's see how it cuts. Pretty good. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. So if I run my nail along the edge of the knife here, I can feel for any nicks and rolls. And it does feel like it is grabbing into my nail a little bit more than before, but I can't feel any substantial nicks or rolls. There is definitely a little bit more imperfection than before, which is to be expected. But overall, I'm pretty happy with how that performed.
Okay, time for the final step in the scientific method, and that is to analyze all the testing that I've done. So the very first thing that I tested earlier on in the video was to see if the knife would skate a file after quenching it during heat treat. So if we look back on the clip here, it does appear to be skating the file. The file isn't digging into the steel at all. It does look like it's removing material, but that was just the forge scale, the decarbonization that's formed on top of the steel from being in the forge, and it's just removing that black stuff. It's not actually biting into the metal, and if you hear it, it definitely doesn't sound like it is digging into the steel at all. There's a very distinct difference between it gliding across and it biting in, and it appears to be gliding across. So I would say yes, it did pass the file skating test and we got an adequate quench. Okay, so from our recent testing, we tested edge retention, and to do that, I just cut a bunch of cardboard. So the knife that I was comparing it to is this folding knife right here. This is the Ontario Rat 2 in D2 high carbon steel. This is a production knife that is professionally heat treated, and I chose this knife to compare it to because it is high carbon steel, same as our fixed blade. I don't have very many knives in high carbon steel, and D2 steel and 1084 steel are kind of in the same ballpark as far as edge retention. Okay, so if we look back at the paper cutting test, after doing 50 total cuts with each blade, the folding knife did quite well, although it did look like it was tearing through the paper a little bit more, but it was cutting. And if we look at the home heat-treated fixed blade, it appeared to be slicing the paper even better. The cuts were much cleaner and it was passing through very nice. So I would say that the fixed blade did better edge retention wise than the folding knife, which I did not expect, especially doing this very DIY at home. Now they are different steels, so results may vary, but by doing this with very simple tools and methods, I am very pleased with how this came out. So the final round of testing that I did was testing the toughness or edge durability on this knife, and to do that I just did some basic cutting tasks with wood. So in testing the toughness, I am testing the temper of the steel, so that was the final step in heat treating, the tempering process when I cooked the blade in the toaster oven. So I tested how sharp it was by cutting paper beforehand and afterwards, and you can see that it was definitely cutting the paper better at the beginning, which is to be expected. It would be kind of weird if it cut it better afterwards. I also ran my fingernail across the edge of the blade before and after. Before, it was very glassy smooth. It took very little pressure to drag the entirety of the edge across my nail. It wasn't digging in or anything. It was very glassy smooth. Afterwards, it definitely took a little bit more effort to drag it all the way through. There was a little bit of nicks, especially down here closer to where I was doing push cuts. But that was to be expected. There weren't any major rolls or big chips out of the edge, which I'm very pleased with. So from giving it very basic use, that wasn't crazy. I'm not throwing it at bricks or anything because I put a lot of work into this and I don't want to destroy it. So looking back at the testing that we did and looking back at my hypothesis question, which was, can I get an adequate heat treat at home using very simple tools and methods? To that, I would say yes. I definitely got an adequate heat treat. It was much better than I was expecting. So I think that the quench, which was hardening the blade and making it stay sharp for a long time, it definitely worked. It skated a file and it stayed sharp for a long time afterwards. So the quench was successful. And as far as the temper goes, it held up very well. It didn't break or crack or crumble or anything like that.
So I would say that the temper also passed as well. So to answer the question all in all, yes, I can get an adequate heat treat. Okay, that brings us to the end of this project. I'm very proud with how the knife came out. It looks great and performs great as well. I definitely learned a lot, and you can see that there is a lot that goes into knife making, and there is a lot of science and in-depth stuff into the metallurgy part, and I'm barely scratching the surface. It's crazy all the complications in such a simple object. So that's it from me. That was my personal project, fall 2022-2023. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.